And it's definitely interesting when thinking about the work of Kierkegaard, who is most famous for his theory of subjectivity, which is that our understanding can only be subjective, which is in sharp contrast to the scientific mindset that was happening at the time, that everything can be quantized into data, that everything can be understood. And according to Kierkegaard, the only thing you can really understand is yourself, which is interesting given that that is the truth as you could possibly understand it, and given that that is a tool of introspection, which is something that Kierkegaard was definitely very interested in doing, as he shows with his writings and journals and the various things that he wrote throughout his life. And so it's very interesting to think about anxiety as being a response to the world, but also an unexpected, though of course necessary response, which is something that I actually think about Kierkegaard in terms of the fact that he probably actually had, for lack of a better phrase, clinical anxiety, and he uses writing as a way to deal with such things, as a way to deal with the negative emotions that were constantly plaguing him due to personal losses and various things that were out of his control. And I think Kierkegaard is interesting because he captures this tension between wanting to understand, which is why he was writing so much, to wanting to just be able to survive and get by, and recognizing that you might not actually be able to know. And I think that that was one of Kierkegaard's biggest strengths, is to recognize that you can't know, to recognize that in life, we have to be the one to establish our own meaning. Kierkegaard was able to do that with his own religion and with his writings and with his studies. But sometimes we're not always as lucky. And so that's why I think an existentialist anxiety, or the anxiety that comes from reality itself, is something that can't be avoided and something that a lot of people feel. And we could cite Jean-Paul Sartre here, where Sartre was very much focused on this idea that we have to be the one to establish our own project and decide our own meaning. And that seems to be one of the forerunning pieces of existentialism, which is the idea that we have to be the one to decide what the meaning is. We have to be the ones to establish the meaning for ourselves. And I think that's super interesting because things might feel super dark and they might feel so meaningless and nihilistic. But it seems to me that we nonetheless have to do our best to get through and to be able to establish the meaning. Now, of course, such a view does go against the scientific approach, which is very much data-driven and particular and even atomized to the point to where it can seemingly explain everything. At least that's one of the presuppositions. But it is really interesting that existentialism, in a very creative way, actually goes against the common tendency of science at the time, and makes it to where it's obviously much more complicated, which is why Kierkegaard is so interesting, because he writes his own system even while also acknowledging that his system is not going to be perfect. And so I think it's interesting that Kierkegaard used writing and his philosophical ideas as a way to explore these very real topics, and using it as a tool for introspection and self-reflection, and making it to where he was able to really think about these things and be able to make sense of life in the best way that he could. And I think that's one of the great lessons of existentialism, such as through the writing of Kierkegaard, which is that we can find that meaning by being creative, by expressing ourselves, by being able to share our philosophical arguments, and being able to analyze things not just through the accumulation of data, but also through our own introspection and self-reflection.